Hey guys, Shift 838 here. I've had a few users ask me about how I gone about and soldered up and put together an F18A since it's a pretty much complete surface mount, the exception of the connectors itself. So I thought I'd do a quick video, and it's probably not going to be real quick, but I will fast forward at certain points so you don't have to watch me put everything on the board, you know, at super slow paces. Um, I've gotten fairly good at putting one of these together. I get one done within, you know, 25, 30 minutes typically. Um, like I said, they do use surface mount components. So let me show you the board itself, unpopulated. So this is the board, unpopulated. As you can see, a lot of surface mount components. Pretty much all the components itself, resistors, capacitors, the oscillating crystal, the FPGA, everything is, of course, surface mount. The FPGA, I believe the pin spacing is like 0.625 millimeter. It's pretty small. So you have to have a decent microscope. I have a USB microscope I bought, and it does work pretty well. I can get it close. I can turn around and it's a manual focus. Bring it back down. Of course, it's all blurry until I focus it again. I've done some pre-staging already. Got the components pretty much set up where I'll just have to grab and go, just to reduce video time. But I will recommend that if you're doing any type of board that has a good amount of surface mount components, then if you're ordering your own boards through JLC, PCB, or any other PCB production warehouse or manufacturer, I would suggest paying the extra few dollars. It's usually, I think I pay about $6 for them, and it's an actual stencil. So it's a metal stencil that they cut out all these components. I can't show it to you because it's actually fairly large, even though it's not. This is not very big. I just never trimmed it down, and I have a little, almost like a jig of tape set up that I can just slide this in, and it fits exactly where it needs to go. Then I use some solder paste and put it on with a 1-inch metal putty knife, basically, and scrape it off. Get some decent solder paste, otherwise you will have a lot of problems. So this is what it looks like after I put the paste on. Grab a little closer and zoom in a little bit for you, and you can see solder paste gets it on the pads very nicely. So the other thing I want to show before I get off on putting this thing together is this F18A. This is the VGA version, the original version that Matthew came out with, the developer. He's currently working on an MK2 version, but that's come into supply issues because of the FPGA that he designed it around, and it looks like he's going to have to redesign it with a more available FPGA due to the chip shortage. This thing works in pretty much any system that uses a TMS 9918 or 9929 video display processor. It will replace it. ColecoVision, there's Sega's, there's MSX, there's the Nanos, and of course the TI-994A, the Coleco Atom. I mentioned the Coleco Atom. This won't fit directly into the Atom just like it is, right? It needs an adapter board, hence the adapter board. This is a blank one, and here's one that's been put together. And how this mounts, so you actually have all of your pins for the actual socket that has to be installed to be able to plug in there to allow enough grab. Otherwise, it's too loose. And then, of course, this is where the actual F18 gets installed. It just actually drops on the top of it, and you just solder the pins through it. These pins can be difficult to solder. I know people that have had issues trying to get it done. I haven't had that many issues. I've had one or two that I've had to redo a pin or so. I think I had one I actually shipped out that the pin came out and I didn't realize it. So the guy sent it back and I fixed it. But we're going to use some standard soldering tips. So I've got the small one here. It's not hot. That's why I can touch it. So this is the small one. Let's bring it down here. It's about like so. It's just a little small chisel tip is all this is. The other one we're going to use, and this is what I found out I've had to do with these surface mount components, especially, with the FPGA, things like that, actual ICs. So I actually bring this up a little bit and let's focus it. So as you can see, this is almost, it's not really, it's a beveled tip, as you can see. And focus a little bit more. And this tip I'll use with the kind of a drag method. There's a trick to it. So on top of the drag method, you're going to need some solder braid. And, any type of solder braid will do. Voila. This is just 2.5 millimeter width is all this is. I think I got them on Amazon. I think I got 6 of them for like $5 or something. So I also use a hot air rework station. And it's not anything extensive. It's just a little cheapy one that I picked up. Just blows hot air. Allows me to, gauge, the intensity of the fan, being, blowing the hot air itself. I can even, of course, control the actual temperature. Now, for the regular soldering iron, you want to get solder paste and solder that has a very low melting point. I found out the hard way that these pads that are on here, I always forget about refocusing. These pads that are on here, I think I had my soldering iron heated up to like 700 degrees or something, and it was way too hot, and I didn't even realize I had it that high. I forgot I was soldering something that required it that high the night before, and as soon as I touched the pad, it was like just within just a half a second. Next thing I know, the pad was completely lifted. So, word to the wise, get you some low melting solder. That way you can set it as low as you can. And it really helps when you're doing the dragging method because you're going to be heating it up. Now I also use, this is in my own little spray bottle. This is actually just 99% alcohol. That's what this is. I use that. I actually bought a soft bristled toothbrush to be able to scrub it on there. If I have to get, a little harder, then I got an anti-static medium bristle I can actually use. So let's go ahead and get into it. And we're going to go ahead and start placing these components. But like I told you before, I will be fast forwarding it. That way you won't see me do all these components exactly the way or as long as it would actually take. Since I've done so many of these, I've pretty much got them memorized. So just bear with me, and I'm going to fast forward it here in a few moments where I'm going to do the capacitors first. Then I'm going to go through and do the resistors. Then I'll put everything else on the board that I have to. I'll slow it down once I start after I get done with the resistors and everything, I'll slow the video back down where you can actually see what I'm doing, because I'll have some other stuff I want to explain on how I'm aligning things and everything like that. So just sit tight. Okay, so next we have all the capacitors and the resistors actually installed. So if you bring these up a little bit, you'll be able to see. You can see how little some of these capacitors are and resistors. The ones you're looking at now through here, these are 0603 package, really small. So that's why I use some tweezers. I even use them for the bigger ones, like which are 0805 packages. And try not to use magnetic tweezers because these, since they're steel, they'll stick. It kind of sucks. Now, one of the things you may have saw me do at the very beginning was when I actually put a resistor or capacitor down, after I put it down, I'll actually tap it. And that kind of sets it into the solder paste. That way when you're using the hot air, it's less likely it's going to move and try to blow off the board. The smaller ones, sometimes they can. They'll move around. So once you kind of get them melted around, you'll just move them back around. That will actually probably happen when I do it, but we'll see. So the next thing we need to do is we're going to actually put on our LED. Now these LEDs, I don't know if you're going to be able to see it or not. Let me see if I can get it on there so you can see it. If you bring it up super close, yeah, you should be able to see that. See a little green dot? That indicates the polarity. And on the F18 boards, the green dot needs to face to the left edge of the board. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to put on our voltage regulators. So we have two different voltage regulators that are required for this board. And it's easy to tell how the VR1 goes, just simply because there's only one way it's going to fit on the pads. VR2, on the other hand, it's a six pin. See if I can get it focused for you. Maybe. There you go. And you can see the little dot on the bottom left leg. That's pin number 1. And on this board, let's see if I can get the board up there so you can see it. You might not be able to see it with the solder paste. If not, no, you can see it on VR2. So you can see the little dot where it shows pin 1, bottom left. So that's where we're going to place that. And I'll do the same thing usually as I'll tap it as well, just to set it into the paste. So the next thing we're going to do is the crystal. Now these crystals have a little dot on them. Just focus. That dot signifies, of course, just like all other ICs, that is pin number 1. So let's go ahead and put that down. So one thing you're going to notice on this, if you haven't already, and I'm not going to do anything with these areas up here, this R24, this Q1 here, these three resistors here, R21, 22, and 23, they're not used. But since I ordered the actual stencil with it, it gets covered in solder paste. But they're not going to be used. So now I'm going to bring my microscope down a little bit to make it a little easier to see. I'm going to turn the little light up a little bit, refocus. So we're going to grab this an IC that goes right here and put that puppy down. And if you look closely, you can see pin 1 is on the bottom right. Just try to center it as best as you can. And with the solder paste, it's usually fairly easy for you to be able to tap it, give it a little bit of pressure one way or the other, and it will move. Now for the two main components, so it looks like it's pretty close. A little bit of adjustment, not much. It's still off. It needs to go up a little bit. That looks pretty good. So we'll rotate the board a little bit. Now we're going to put the main FPGA on. Okay. So this little dot here signifies pin 1, lines up with the board. And I almost got that perfect. With these FPGAs that have pins down every side, you have to check each side to make sure everything is lined up the way it is. And as you can see, I'm looking at a trace here. I try to look at traces on the left and the right side, or the top and the bottom on the side, to make sure it's coming in where it's supposed to be. And it looks pretty good. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to heat it up. Now, what I typically do, you don't want to heat it up on, your actual table or something. I have empty solder spools pretty much everywhere, and I just use them as a little pedestal to heat these things up. And while I'm waiting on the actual heat gun to heat up, the hot air gun, it only takes a minute, I'm going to go ahead and change my tip to the actual beveled tip that I showed you before, this one, because right after we're done heating it up, I'll let the board cool, and then I'll fast forward the video so you don't have to wait for the board to cool, because it will be very hot to the touch. And I do have my soldering iron set pretty low. I have my solder paste melts at like 185 degrees Celsius, so mine's set pretty low. Focus this a little bit more. Okay, so I'm going to move this where you can see the flow. I'm going to start at the LED and work down that resistor some. And what it does, it starts hardening and evaporating the chemicals that are actually in the solder paste. And as you can see, it's all melted. So it don't take long. And as you see, the resistors actually do kind of move in spots, move in place. The components will, to a point. So a lot of times they'll straighten out if you don't get them exactly right. See, I told you we'd see one move. So you saw that one move. So let's keep the heat on a little bit. Just move it back over and it's perfect. But do remember that with these components, heat can be your enemy. So that's why I said, for the FPGA and stuff, you definitely want some kind of low melting point solder paste. I've done this before with a really small solder diameter. I gotta tell you, it sucked. I've also done it with a syringe of solder paste, and although it works, it's very tedious and can definitely turn you off of working with surface mount components. I typically save my big ICs for last. As you see, that one moved. I probably hit it, but it doesn't take much, and it's back in its spot. Just soldering the last of the actual capacitors and resistors. And of course we hit this IC here. Go ahead and hit the FPGA. Now I can guarantee you're going to have solder bridges doing this, and that's why we're going to use the drag method here in a minute. Use the drag method, then we'll clean it up with a solder wick. And once it's all clean, we'll use my 99% alcohol and clean it up real nice. And then we'll be able to check all the spots to make sure they look good. Turn around, do one more side. And I've got my temperature on this fairly low. Like I said, my solder paste melts very low. I also have my fan or my blower set at minimum. So now we're going to let this cool. We'll be back in a few minutes. It'll be a few seconds for y'all. Okay, we are back, and it's cool enough for us to start messing with. As you can see right off the bat, you can see some solder bridges. Like I said, these pins are fairly small, in spacing. But with the drag method, we can actually get all of this gunk on this side that's all pinned, all boogered up and having solder bridges, and we can move it all down to one side, and then we clean up that one side, re-hit it, and it's usually good to go. So, but one of the tricks to be able to do that is you got to have some solder flux, liquid solder flux. This is what I use. It's made by SRA, right? It's 80% water, or soluble. I'm sorry. So this is the one I use, and I was seeing if it actually had a part number on here. I think it's the STE10 is what it is, I believe. No, that's Sweet 10. What am I talking about? Here's the part number right there. Let me focus. I actually order mine because I actually get it cheaper than Amazon, believe it or not, if I order it directly from sra-solder.com. So, but of course, I don't use that bottle to disperse it. I actually have a very smaller bottle with a needle on it. That way it allows me to, get a little bit more control. So what I usually do is the main chips I'm worried about is this one here. We already saw readjust. So I'm usually look at this one, I look at this one, which is the main FPGA, and I look at this one here. Just simply because all the other solder stuff, with the surface mount, since they're just resistors and stuff like that, they're typically pretty good. I've only run into one problem where I actually missed a pin on VR2 right here, so it wouldn't program. And it was just one pin I missed, but it caused a problem. So, but the first thing I do is we're going to put some solder around these chips. And as you see, I use a pretty good amount just because, you know, if I use too less, it doesn't flow right. So I'm going to show you how I do it with the actual drag technique now. So using that beveled tip like this, my first thing I'll do is I'll take this end of the beveled tip and I'll rest it where it's on top of the legs that are meeting the actual pads. And then I will move it down. And as you can see, it moved the solder down to the end. But that's not all I do. I'll turn around and I'll tilt this up some, and I'll get the edge of this beveled tip, and I can feel where the actual feet meet. And I'll move it all the way down again, as far as I can go, to make sure it's all the way down. And I'll do this on every one of them. And it's not just for this board. Anytime you mess with surface mount components, I found that this method works good for me. If you have another method that works better for you, then use it, definitely. But this is what I found works for me. It doesn't take too long. I'll usually go ahead and just re-hit these just to reflow, just because those pins are fairly well spaced. And I don't really have to worry about them not, getting bridged. Guess I should have made sure, so re-hit these. Like I was saying, is what I usually do is I'll rest it and drag it across to get as much of that solder at the end of the pins that I can. Then I'll tilt it up, and where I feel the IC feet meeting the actual pads, then I'll go down with the edge, the pointed section of this pin, of this solder tip, and that'll usually bring it, to where I need it to be. Once I'm done with that, then the next thing I do is I get my solder wick. Let me go ahead and trim it. And it doesn't take much for this to work. And then it's, as you can see, it's gone, but it still has a little, one little bridge there. Now I'll usually just go right back over it. And at the end, I will, instead of going past it, I'll go to the end and stop, and I'll pull it down. And that typically gets rid of it. See, that's all nice and pretty, right? So we're going to do this around all of them. I'll get this bottom one here at the same time, since it's facing the same way. And then I will do the same thing, lift it up. Sometimes you'll find a stubborn area. This one didn't do it, but sometimes you'll get a stubborn area where you just can't completely get it off. And I found that adding more flux seems to help pretty well. So that one looks good too. So we just have, looks like 3 more to do. Make sure you always clean your solder tip. I don't use a sponge. I just use a set of, like that brass wool is all I do. My fingers aren't working today. And the reason I run it back after I take that off is just to make sure the legs actually gets resoldered back down to the pad if it happened to take all of the solder off. I've had that happen, so that's why I do that. All this looks good. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to clean it up with my alcohol. You can probably hear me spraying it. And what did I do with my toothbrush? And I'll usually give it a few squirts, a couple of times, scrub it. Then I'll usually spray it another couple of times, and then I'll wipe it down. And then after I get it wiped down, I'll take the harder bristle brush and scrub the pins, and then blow them off. Just if there's any, extra stuff that got on there that shouldn't have, from scrubbing or wiping it off. So now, so you can see after scrubbing it with alcohol, it looks pretty good. I don't see any solder bridges. There, it's good. That one looks good. That one looks good. And if you want, you can check, your voltage regulators and your level shifters and, everything if you really want to, which I've had to do before because something wouldn't program right. So all that looks good. So the next piece is actually soldering the connector zone. So I pre-stage my connectors. This is the jumpers. One thing I have to do, I actually have to switch out my solder tip. And of course, I'm doing it while it's hot, so that's always fun. And just for reference, the soldering iron that I'm using, it's a Haco or Haco or however it's pronounced. I don't know how it's pronounced. I'm from Texas, so I say Haco. Just put my soldering tip, my other soldering tip on. Let it heat back up. New tip. And we're going to use a small diameter solder for this particular connector. And the connector I'm putting on there actually controls some jumper settings, like if you want scan lines or whatever. This diameter of this solder is 0.025 inches, so it's pretty small. I try to keep a few different ones on hand. The next connector I put on is the actual JTAG programming header here. You see, it really doesn't take that long to put one of these together. But you just have to kind of like pre-stage stuff and get things ready. I'm not going to put together 15 of them at one time. I may put together 3 or 4 at one time. Um, but otherwise, and I try to, whenever I get orders, it's I'll try to do 2 or 3 orders at the same time. Now I use the bigger solder for this connector just simply because it's bigger. This one I always got to adjust a little bit so I can make sure it's even. A little bit too much. There we go. And this is the connector that will actually the IDC VGA ribbon cable connects to. One more. Now the last piece is, so if you're doing ColecoVision, then you need the tall pins. There's a few other systems that would require the tall pins, but most systems actually, majority of the ones that I've had to build for require the normal pins, which are these little bitty things right here, right? I've actually already pre-staged a connector for me to, or I've got like a little jig that I use for programming as well as getting these pins in. And looks like I lost a few pins that were in it, so I'm actually going to have to put some in, just like 3 or 4 of them real quick. And this is done with tweezers. It's just this is probably the worst part, I think, is doing this. Let's see, one more. There we go. So like I said, I pre-staged this. I probably accidentally hit it. Yeah, there's those 4 pins. So I pre-staged it. So you can see little pins are in here, right? So if I pull one out, see, you can see. Just a little socket is all it is. So this just goes just like this. Now, this little jig I also use to program these F18As. Along with this, I mean, really the only thing the jig's doing is supplying power. That's it. 5 volts. That's all it's doing. That sucker's stuck in. So, and I'll use these. Man, I am not having a good evening. I had them all in, and they were all, one was out. So if you look real close, you can see, the pins in there. They don't come all the way through. The normal pins don't. So when you solder them, you have to make sure you definitely solder them and get them soldered. And I'll show you the trick that I use to make sure. So again, I'm using the small 0.025, right? Make sure your tip's nice and clean. See, I can put it just barely on the corner. Just a little bit, just to get it flowing. And I'll put some more in there and get it to kind of bubble up. And I'll do that on every one of these. Now the tall pins, they stick through, just like a regular socket would. So it's much easier. I do clean my solder tip quite frequently. And once I get these soldered, I'm actually not done, just to make sure they're going to stay in. Now the ones that are kind of tricky to solder are these little two right here, because they're really close to a couple of capacitors. And that's one reason I use a smaller tip. Because with the smaller tip, I can get in there as long as I make it where the chisel's almost vertical. So that's soldered. So the next thing I'll do to try to force the solder down onto the pin a little more is I'll just start. Let me just get this where you can see it. There you go. I'll just start going over it, with the flat piece of the actual solder tip. And I'll do that a little bit. And I found that if I didn't do this, then I might have one or two that I had to resolder. But if I just took an extra few seconds and did this, I usually don't have a problem where I got to resolder something. But on this side, I'm pretty careful because these pins are over here, and I don't want to slip up and rebridge something. I got to go back through and unbridge again. And I'll do the same thing on these two here, usually just a little bit. If I recall right, these two actually aren't connected to anything. There's no signals that go to them. They're just there for support. So take it off. This is the finished board before programming. Now this uses a Linux-based option on a virtual server, a program to program this FPGA called Impact. And it has a special MCS file that's strictly geared for this FPGA. as well as this chip here. Has to be selected correctly. Otherwise, it will not program. Now, one thing I want to stress, if anyone tries to build one of these things um, with the atom adapter, is one thing I have found out that I have to do just to get it to lay better is after I solder the jumper, the 8-pin jumper. Once I solder it, I'll have to, get some snips, that are the angled snips like that, right? So they get down pretty close, and I'll have to clip them, just so it sits, just so the atom adapter board it sits nicer, when they're married together. That's all. So I'm not going to go through the programming, but this is my trick to do it. It usually takes about 45 seconds to program, not too long, 45 seconds to a minute. If it fails, then the only thing I can tell people is check your connections. Make sure your ICs are, facing the right way. You got pin 1 to pin 1, etc. Make sure you have no bridges. If it all looks good and it's still not programming, rerun a solder, down it, redo it. Something's probably not right. If it's still not working, then you could have a bad IC. These FPGAs are very hard to find right now with the chip shortage. I've bought all the stock that I could find at one particular place that I found that had them. The rest of them they actually tossed because they were so bad oxidized. They didn't feel good enough to send me any. Not even a couple of the tests to make sure they were going to be good. They said no, and they tossed them because they were so bad. They sent me pictures. They were pretty bad. Looked like they were exposed to the elements for a while. But I bought all the last ones that they had. So if you find them, great. I can tell you from experience, I've bought 5 or 6 on eBay, and I know 4 out of 5 or 4 out of 6 were fakes, and the other 2 were good. Not a real good ratio. And I had to wait for PayPal to get involved to resolve that stipulation that complaint I did, because the seller, I think, knew they were fake and sold them to me and wouldn't refund, wouldn't communicate at all. So just be wary where you buy them if you're trying to buy these things, because there's a lot of fakes out there. And that's it. If y'all have any questions, leave them in comments. You can hit my website. It's going to be shown at the end of this video, or my store at the end of this video. If y'all are looking to get onto a retro BBS, my BBS Heatwave is online, and it runs on a vintage Myrick G 9640 computer from the 80s. So, and it's open to anyone who wants to log in. So thanks again for watching. Y'all have a good one.